I was so much looking forward to this conversation and talk to you about how we can reprogram our brain and break the habits that don't serve us and hopefully create new patterns and habits that can help us change our lives and create new way of being which is more aligned with who we are or who we are inspired to become.
Thanks for having me.
I know it's a lot to unpack here, but I want to start with how do we create patterns and what role our brain plays in forming those patterns and actually choosing which ones to keep and which ones to let go of.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so a lot of this goes back to our, basic evolutionary core processes around needing to remember where food is so we can find it again. And also, I guess, remembering where danger is so we can avoid it in the future. And these processes are set up through positive and negative reinforcement. And this has been shown to be evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize back in 2000 showing that sea slugs form memory in these types of habit loops. So it's a very well-known process. So the question is, how do we know what to learn and set up as a habit and what to not learn? And probably 95% of our habits are actually very, very helpful for us. Imagine having to relearn everything from walking to eating to making breakfast every day. We'd be exhausted before we even made it to noon. So it's very helpful. I think of habits as set and forget. So it's helpful to set a habit, forget about the details. Yet sometimes these habits kind of they're helpful for a while and then get in our way. And sometimes they're just never helpful, but we don't notice them. So our brains have this system, it's this reward hierarchy where they will preference certain behaviors over others. And that preference is set up based on how rewarding they are. So both in terms of, let's use a simple example like broccoli versus chocolate, right? Chocolate's more calorically dense. So from an evolutionary standpoint, our survival brain is going to say, hey, eat the chocolate, prefer that over broccoli because you can get those calories in, you can save them for later, lay them down as fat in case there's a famine. So we've got these inborn mechanisms to prefer things, yet in modern day, we've also, people have figured out how to engineer food and to, engineer our attention, et cetera, to get us hooked on certain things, even though we don't really need them. So for example, we start to learn to eat when we're bored or sad or angry or frustrated instead of when we're actually hungry. And this is so common that scientists had to come up with a term that's a misnomer. It's called hedonic hunger. And it's a misnomer because we're eating in the absence of hunger. So it's not actually hunger. It's the hedonic piece says it all. It's around eating because of emotions. So that's a kind of, the basic premise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And speaking about the reward system, I'm just like curious, like for instance, when we have good habits, obviously we feel good afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And when we want to like change from one to another, it's pretty easy to do. But then when we have bad habits, especially if we talk about addiction,
Mm-hmm.
then obviously like yeah, we feel good for I don't know, for an hour, but then it's very painful and still we cannot change that behavior. Why
Yes.
is that?
Well, there are a number of factors that play into that. So it depends on what the habit is. But with any habit, one common factor is that our brains don't like change. And so anytime we're faced with change, our brain has to look at that as, is this dangerous or is this different? Right? Because we're out of our comfort zone, we're out of our routine. So that could be any habit from, trying to exercise more to using cocaine. you know, our brain's still going to go through that same process. So here, let's say chemical dependencies or anything where there's been this manufactured object that tries to, jack our dopamine system, we can go into, think of it as deficit when we've got this urge to do something. our brain says, hey, make that urge go away. This is unpleasant. The urge itself, leads to a craving, and that craving is set up to make us do something. And so if we're not used to tolerating that discomfort, our brain's going to say, well, just do the thing so that you feel better. And that actually gets us stuck in the habit. So for example, with my patients who want to quit smoking, they often will smoke every 2 hours because that's about the half-life of nicotine, where their nicotine levels go low enough that the receptors in their brains start getting irritated, and they say, hey, I need some more nicotine to fire off these receptors. And so that unpleasantness of withdrawal sends somebody out for a smoke break. They go and smoke a cigarette. They feel better. They get back to baseline. And that process just repeats itself. For people that smoke a pack of cigarettes a day, it repeats itself up to 20 times a day. We all come to our lives with different genetics, different conditioning, and different habits. So, let's use, I don't know, we can use the chocolate, for example, in binge eating. If somebody has set up the habit of binge eating as a way to numb themselves, I'm actually thinking about a patient that just sent me an email recently that I'd taken care of 8 years ago. She was about 30 years of age when she came to see me, and had been binging on entire large pizzas 20 out of 30 days a month. So really struggling. And it was because the only mechanism that she'd learned to, as she described it, numb herself from her negative emotions was binge eating. So that was a really ingrained habit for her. And, she had tried everything to stop doing it, of course, because she didn't like it. She felt guilty afterwards. Sometimes her guilt would even lead to another binge because it was a negative emotion. And so we can tell ourselves, oh, I shouldn't do this. I know this is bad for me. Everybody knows this, but they get stuck in their heads. And if you look at the neuroscience suggests that willpower is more myth than muscle. And so from a neuroscientific standpoint, in my clinic, I'd seen that my patients had really, willpower had failed them, let's say. So we took a neuroscience approach, which was to say, okay, let's lean into this reward-based learning system and see if we can leverage it. And if if it says, okay, you're going to form a habit when it's rewarding, you can unlearn it by paying attention and seeing that it's unrewarding. And so, for example, I started having my patients who wanted to quit smoking pay attention as they smoke cigarettes, and they realized that cigarettes tasted pretty crappy. And that crappy taste helped them become disenchanted with the behavior. That disenchantment is what drove the change in behavior. It wasn't willpower, it wasn't anything else. We've even done studies where we find, we have this app called Eat Right Now, where within 10 to 15 times of somebody paying attention to what it feels like when they overeat, that reward value drops below zero. So we even have scientific evidence at a population level where we can see it's that awareness that's the key ingredient, say, for change rather than willpower.
There's so many different modalities, and many of those from their alternative medicine perspective, like hypnosis. Some, I don't know, I know people do mushrooms, like microdosing on that. Also, speaking about if, for instance, someone is struggling with binge eating, there are a lot of different drugs on the market, like
Mm-hmm.
Manjaro, Ozempic. Can it be helpful in the process of change and breaking those addictive behaviors?
Well, that's a whole conversation. We could spend hours on each of those topics. So there is some pilot work, for example, with psilocybin, suggesting that it can be helpful with the addictive process. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done there. And then also people need to figure out, if these things do work for addictions, how do you scale that? Because it's not just, hey, take some shrooms, there's a whole set and setting that goes into that. If you look at these GLP-1 medications, for example, they're very early on in the life cycle of any medication, in the sense that, there's, certainly the drug companies are reporting positive results, and we don't know what the long-term results are. We also, there are a lot of unknowns there. So again, I'm not advocating for or against any of these medications. I just think that it's important that we keep our eyes open and collect as much information as possible to see for whom and for how long, et cetera. regardless of the medication, anyone can learn how their mind works and learn how to work with their mind. So that piece is, to me, critical, regardless of whether somebody uses a substance, whether it's a natural one or a manufactured one. And I see the mind training as being instrumental in parallel. If somebody's going to use a GLP-1 drug or going to use, mushrooms or something like that, it can be really helpful as an on-ramp. It can be really helpful in conjunction, and it's always going to be helpful for the rest of our life to be learning how to leverage the strength of our minds.
And speaking about our minds, what is the first step to get more connected to who we are, learn more about ourselves, build that self awareness? Is it meditation or maybe some other modalities? What do you think is the most helpful first step?
I think it depends on the person. I started meditating back at the beginning of medical school and found it, very challenging, but also one of the most important things that I ever did in my life. And that actually I didn't know it at the time, but it set up the trajectory for me to actually be doing a lot of meditation related research and also develop programs based on mindfulness for habit change. I would say, meditation, some people feel like they're allergic to meditation, or they feel like they're never, they don't know how to do it, or not going to be able to do it. So I simplify it and look at the core elements that are key to any meditative tradition or practice, which are really about awareness and curiosity. And so we all have this capacity to be curious, and that's something that we can foster. And at the same time, we can even leverage this reward system in our brain to see how rewarding curiosity actually feels. And just to be clear, there are two types of curiosity. One's called deprivation curiosity, when we don't know the answer to something. That's a more dopamine driven process. That's not the one I'm talking about. The one I'm talking about is called interest curiosity, where we're just interested in what's happening. So, for example, with my patients who are struggling with a craving, we train them to get interested and curious. Oh, what does that craving feel like as compared to the, oh no, here's a craving, I have to fight with it. Flipping that, oh no, to, oh, is really empowering, but it also helps us see how much better it feels not to fight with a craving and instead to dance with it, to even get close to it as we get curious about it. And that helps disarm these concepts of craving that can be really scary, and helps us see that they're physical sensations, they're thoughts, they're emotion, and they come and go.
When you get curious about what you actually feel behind those cravings, what do you do next? Do you try to find something similar that would fulfill you in the same way, but it's more beneficial for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So trying to shift to a more positive thing can be an addiction itself, right? And then when it doesn't work, we wonder what's wrong, or if there's something wrong with us. So here, you know, the beauty of it is that we can see, the craving is never going to be satisfied. That by definition, the process is set up to make us want more and get stuck in that cycle. This goes, you can read literature back to the Buddhist time, even before paper was even invented. They were talking about these cycles of craving and suffering. And one of the translations of the word samsara means endless wandering, because we are constantly chasing our tail, trying to get more, trying to get more, trying to get more. Another image that's used is one of a hungry ghost, where you can imagine a ghost that has a small mouth, a narrow esophagus, and a huge stomach. And so no matter how much it eats, it's never going to be full. That's what addiction's about. So trying to substitute one, let's say I had a patient who was substituting cocaine for exercise. And of course, exercise is healthier than cocaine. Yet when this person over-exercised and got injured, he was in trouble because his brain said, well, I need my fix. And of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, but unfortunately, this is often where people just go back to the old substance because they haven't learned how to work with the process. So this isn't as much about the thing as it is about learning to master the process itself.
If we kind of go a little bit deeper into addiction, what do you think their underlying reason for it?
Yeah, I think, and it is, there are as many answers as there are people for that, because everybody has a combination of genes and environment. And so it's their genes combined with their upbringing, combined with their current circumstances. So it's hard to generalize and say, oh, it's, this category versus this category, because certainly genes play a role. Certainly environment plays a role. What we do know, though, is that regardless of who won the genetic lottery or not, where some people don't seem to be, caught up in any unhealthy habits, whereas some other people, there's like anything they touch becomes an addiction. We do know that regardless of the genetic environment or even our, background, we all can learn to work with our minds.
If someone has no experience, no knowledge of where to start, what is the best place to start?
I would say, and this is, I've seen this in our programs, whether it's for eating or anxiety or smoking or whatever. And I'll just say this is all backed up by science. Like, we've done randomized controlled trials where we've gotten a 67% reduction in anxiety. I detail a bunch of that in my Unwinding Anxiety book. So what I'm about to say is based on, we've done decades of research and even done focus group research to ask the users, like, what's your experience? Tell us, what the process is, so that we can actually map it out. And it turns out that there's a 3-step process. And the first step begins with somebody just mapping out the habit loop. What's the trigger? What's the behavior? What's the result? And we can even simplify it to, what's the behavior that I'm doing? And is it serving me? Is it not serving me? Because often we think of good and bad, and that just leads to judgment. So we can remove that layer of commentary, let's say, and get it right at the raw, experience. Like, hey, is this helping my life, or is this not helping my life? So once we identify the behavior, which could be stress eating, it could be worrying, it could be anything, we can then the second step is to really tap into the strength of our brain's reward system, where it is highlighting, awareness is the key factor for change. And so we can ask a simple question: what am I getting from this? Not intellectually, but really feeling into our direct experience. And it can be helpful just to look back on the last time we did X, Y, or Z to see what the result was. This links up the cause and effect relationship, which is the driver for reward-based learning. It's called reward-based learning because if something's rewarding, we're going to keep doing it. If it's not, we're going to stop. So if somebody realizes that the cigarette tastes like crap, if somebody realizes that overeating really doesn't feel good, they get the gut bomb. If somebody realizes that worrying is not actually helping them perform at their job or in life, then they become disenchanted. And then the third step is what I call finding the bigger, better offer. So again, leveraging this reward system in the brain, we can start to ask, well, what's better? And this isn't just providing a substitution, but finding an intrinsically rewarding behavior. And these tend to come, the two buckets that I think of are curiosity and kindness. And both of these are intrinsically rewarding. So it's not substituting exercise for cocaine. It's bringing in curiosity when we have a craving. That's really different because it helps us learn to work with the craving. And at the same time, see and feel the curiosity is more rewarding than fighting a craving. So that's the 3 steps that we've found. And, we found it in a number of different modalities.
How long does it take on average to break bad habits and maybe, get more comfortable with better habits?
Are you asking me, or are you asking the internet? And I
Because, like,
say that,
again, it's like
well,
some people say it's like 21 days, others 60 something days. But then I know so many people, they've been struggling for years.
yes. So if you ask the internet, the most popular answer is 21 days. And that comes from a book that a plastic surgeon wrote in the 1960s about how long it took his patients to get used to their new nose jobs. Okay. So there's an internet meme for you, or a myth that has absolutely no basis in science. But, it sounds good. It's a nice even number. It's like, oh yeah, 3 weeks, that sounds good, but it doesn't mean it's true. So the truth is that there are very few studies that have actually been published on this. And also, if you look at it, it's really hard to study behavior change writ large. What behavior are you talking about? What people are you talking about? All of this. So that's why you see a wide range. So I can say from our studies, for example, with people who struggle with overeating, it only takes 10 to 15 times of them overeating for that reward value in their brain to change from, drop below zero. And they start shifting behavior. Now, that doesn't mean 10 to 15 days. It depends on how often somebody overeats. But what that highlights is and of course, we're having them pay attention so that they can really, drive that process of change through that reward-based learning system. So if you leverage the true mechanism, any behavior change is going to happen more quickly. That's, so all bets are off for like willpower or hypnosis or whatever, because we don't know if and what the mechanisms are there. But we do know about reward-based learning. It's pretty clear cut. So the more someone pays attention and sees how unrewarding a behavior is, the more likely they are to shift that behavior more quickly and potentially more permanently. So for example, that patient I mentioned from 8 years ago, she wrote me an email and said, "Hey, I lost over 100 pounds,
Wow.
and it's been 8 years." you know, so I say that because a lot of people, they'll try some fancy diet of du jour, and then it's called yo-yo dieting for a reason, because whatever the diet is, they try it for a while, they might lose some weight, and then they often regain it because they haven't actually tapped into the mechanism of change.